Hi, everyone. I'm excited to have you here for episode 822 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we're rebroadcasting our conversation with our guest, Dr. Jacquelyn Gill. Listeners, Jacquelyn is a paleoecologist. She studies ecology and climate change over the past 20,000 years since the end of the last ice age. This involves taking a forensics-like approach to analyzing the sediments and fossil records in lakes and bogs that give clues about past climates and landscapes. And in our conversation, Jacquelyn shares some fantastic stories about her career, her research, and her life. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. I am delighted to be here today with Dr. Jacquelyn Gill. So great to chat with you today, Jacquelyn. How's everything going?
It's great. We're just melting out from our first big winter storm up here in Maine. And so I'm trying to get as much outdoor activity as I can before it really starts to snow in.
Gotcha. Before winter sets in for real. Well, Jacquelyn, it's wonderful to talk to you today, and I'm excited to introduce you to our listeners. So listeners, Jacquelyn is an assistant professor of paleoecology and plant ecology at the University of Maine. She received her master's degree and PhD in geography from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And afterwards, she served as the Voss Postdoctoral Fellow at Braun University before she joined the faculty there at the University of Maine. Now, Jacquelyn was the recipient of the E. Lucy Braun Award for Excellence in Ecology, the Student Section Award for Excellent Women in Ecology, and the Cooper Award, all from the Ecological Society of America. She also received the Trewarth Award for Best Student Paper, the Graduate Peer Mentor Award, and the Whitbeck Dissertator Fellowship from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And now Jacquelyn is here with us today to tell us all about her journey through life and science. So Jacquelyn, today we want to get to know you, not only as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start us off here by taking a few minutes to tell us what you like to do when you're not doing science?
Yeah, it's a fun question, and I wish that I could do more when I'm not doing science. As an assistant professor, sometimes I feel like I'm spending a lot of time in my office these days, but since I've recently moved back to Maine after doing my undergraduate here, I'm trying to spend as much time outdoors as I can, exploring the forests and the coastlines. I also really enjoy doing some indoor activities. I love to knit, for example. I love reading. I go to a weekly trivia night, and it's really funny. I actually do better on the literature questions sometimes than the science questions.
Really?
Yeah, my science colleagues are always like, why are you our go-to literature person? Because we have this science team of trivia attendees. And so I do love to read. I used to be a bookseller. It's part of how I put myself through college, working in bookstores. And so I think I just have this kind of frustrated English major deep inside me.
Gotcha. Well, that is wonderful, Jacquelyn. I know myself, I can only get the biology questions. I'm a total failure when it comes to trivia, sports, popular culture, anything like that. But biology, I got that. So
yeah.
That's fantastic. So you mentioned you love to read, and I always like to get book recommendations from the scientists that we have on our show. So can you tell us today, what is a book that you've read and just loved that you think myself and our listeners should check out?
Yeah, actually, there's a couple. One of them is a book by Allegra Goodman called Intuition, which really gets at how scientists are people and we have bias, right? It's based on a true story about some cancer research trials that in the lab were really exciting initially, but then there was some trouble with reproducing them. And it really gets into how the lab was trying to get a lot of press really early on. And there's this whole broader context of challenges to science funding in Congress, which was happening in the 80s as well as today, and how there's just some doubts cast on the results that may have something to do with interpersonal conflicts in the lab. And so it's really fascinating to me because there's often this misconception that science is somehow completely objective, but science is done by people and people are subjective. And so all of that really influences our science and how we do science. So to me, even though it was a little bit of a busman's holiday because it was reading about research. I think it was a really fascinating kind of thriller about the process of science from the people angle.
Well, this sounds like an excellent read. So what was the title of this book again?
It's called Intuition, which I love because, scientists aren't supposed to use our intuition.
Right.
Facts. So, yeah.
Well, fantastic recommendation. I'll put that out on our website for our listeners to check out. And I'm going to have to pick up that book as well. Sounds like a great read. Now, Jacquelyn, we've talked a little bit about what you like to do when you're not at work, but can you tell us next about how you describe what you do to someone who might not be in science?
Yeah, so I'm a paleoecologist, which means most of the time I don't get to actually observe my study system. I research the climate change and ecology of the last 20,000 years since the end of the Ice Age. And to do that, because we sadly have not yet invented time machines.
Right. We need to get a move on.
I know, right? That would really help me out. Listeners, if you're working on that, just, get in contact with me. So what we have to do then is we rely on the natural archives of the past. And I like to describe that as something like forensic science. So, a forensic scientist goes out and collects clues that are left behind by an event, in this case, a crime. In my case, I go out into the natural world and I collect the clues that are left behind by past ecosystems. So most of those are archived in the bottom of lakes and bogs. So all that mud and sediment that's down at the bottom of a lake is full of things like pollen, charcoal, bits of plants, and other tiny microscopic components of the fossil record that, when you put them all together, can be used to create a big picture of how the landscape changed. For example, when there was a big climate change event, say it got warm really fast or cold really fast, or humans arrived in an area for the first time, or large animals went extinct, like the mammoths and mastodons that we think of as kind of iconic Ice Age beasts. So I've spent a lot of my time really studying what happens, for example, when we lost our Ice Age herbivores. How did the rest of the landscape respond? And most of my work so far has involved piecing that together from these little tiny bits of ecological flotsam and jetsam that are left behind. And I'm just now starting to get involved in the vertebrate bone record, which is kind of exciting for me too.
Very interesting. Well, I'm excited to chat a little bit more later in our interview about some of these particular projects that you're working on. But this is a fascinating area of study. And I love how you painted it in this mural almost of being a detective, of being a forensic scientist, going back and trying to figure out what happened in earlier times. That's wonderful. So I'm curious now to talk about what motivates you, Jacquelyn. We mentioned a little bit about what you do, but it's, I think, really hard for scientists to get everything done that they need to get done in a day. You mentioned also, particularly as an assistant professor, just getting started sort of on this pathway of a tenure track faculty member. So can you tell us a little bit more about what motivates you and maybe a particular quote or a saying that you love to keep in your mind as you go through your day?
Yeah, I'm very much motivated by environmental concerns. I have been ever since I was a small child. I've grown up running around outside, and I care very deeply about the landscapes that, I've grown up in. And for a long time, I wanted to be more of an environmental scientist or maybe work in policy, but I kept coming back to the past and really understanding this relationship between humans and the natural world and how we develop those connections that really make people care about a place to the point where they want to protect it. And so for me, a quote is actually from a novel, Howard's End, by E.M. Forster, and it's just 2 words, only connect. And it's also the title of a really fantastic essay by Bill Cronin about the importance of a liberal arts education. And for me, trained as a geographer who cares deeply about environmental problems, and also as someone who works with extinct species and the consequences of extinction, this idea of connecting both in terms of people and the natural world, but also connecting all the different pieces of that world, the plants, the animals, the climate, the rocks, but also people's livelihoods, our economies, our passions, making those connections both in my own research, but in my teaching, inspiring students to make those connections. It's something that I'm always striving to do with my work.
Well, that is a perfect quote to keep in your mind. I love that it's nice and short, only 2 words. You can just sort of keep repeating that. That's wonderful. And I love that you really touched on this point of emphasizing interdisciplinary science. I think definitely making these connections across fields, like you're mentioning, kind of studying animals, plants, rocks, climate change, all these things coming together within your research. That's wonderful.
Yeah, I think part of it also comes down to the fact that I love everything and we have so much hyper specialization nowadays. I never felt like I could actually pick, which part of the Earth system I wanted to focus on, which is why I think geography and interdisciplinary science and paleoecology have just been the perfect fit for me.
Well, that totally resonates with me. I know when I was going through graduate school, trying to pick a lab was one of the most difficult, stressful decisions of my life because I was just like, I want to work in all these different labs. It's hard to narrow it down and just focus on one little thing in your research. So great to hear how you've been able to kind of really address a broad variety of different areas through the work that you do. So Jacquelyn, I'm curious now to hear a little bit more about your journey. And can we focus first on talking about some of these people that came along your way who really inspired you or served as role models for you?
Yeah, it's interesting. People often ask the role model question, and my answer is a little bit weird, I think, in that some of my biggest role models are actually people I've never met.
Right.
I mean, I've had fantastic mentors. I definitely credit them with encouraging me and giving me the tools I need to succeed and the confidence that has really helped me on my way. But some of the people that I find the most inspirational are people we don't even know the names of. I really care deeply about women in science, for example, and for many centuries, women have been in science and yet have really labored kind of invisibly, doing a lot of work, even writing manuscripts for their husbands and just kind of this quiet behind the scenes work, often unpaid. Basically, they're so passionate about their science and yet they just didn't have the opportunities to really get out there and be recognized and supported by society as scientists, and yet they were scientists. And so I think often about how lucky I am to have these opportunities to be paid to do what I love, and how for so many centuries, these sort of nameless women just toiled, literally in obscurity, to bring us some of the scientific breakthroughs that we see today. So I actually dedicated my dissertation to all these women that worked in labs, like getting choked up thinking about it, just so I could have the opportunities that I have today.
Absolutely. Well, Jacquelyn, I think this is a really great take on the question of role models. I think that's something that where no one previously has brought up this point. All these people that came before them in terms of these women in science who were hardworking, unnamed, not getting the recognition they deserved for all the work they're putting in, who really paved the way for us women in science currently. So wonderful, wonderful answer to that question. Now, Jacquelyn, can you think back to your very early days and think about these early moments where you were getting excited about the world of science? And can you share with me what really sparked your interest initially?
I've always spent a lot of my time running around outside, and my dad and my stepdad were both in the Navy. So I did a lot of that sort of classic bouncing back and forth. Mm-hmm. But every time I bounced back and forth from one family to the other, it would be in a different place. And so, before the age of 12, grew up in a lot of different parts of the country and even spent a few years in the Mediterranean on a small island in an archipelago in Italy. And I think for me, it's funny because I'm just realizing now this connection with geography that started even at this really young age, where I just saw so many different kinds of landscapes, from New England to Florida to the Virginia coast to Colorado to Michigan to, the Mediterranean. And just thinking about how different those landscapes are, how different the biomes are, the geology is between those places. And for me, it was this sort of fascination with just how different the life around me was and why was that? And, how did those patterns get set up? So from a very early age, I became sort of fascinated with, what creates these patterns of life in these different places.
Well, that is very interesting to hear about how this seed was maybe planted early on and has been blossoming since. So can you take us, from this early point through some of these key moments that really you think got you to where you are today, these things that propelled you along your way through science?
Yeah, so I was really interested in science. By the time I was maybe 12, I think many people that age become really interested in marine biology. It seems like I talk to so many people who say, I wanted to be a marine biologist.
I wanted to train dolphins. Yeah.
Yeah. Working with sharks or coral reefs or something.
Yeah.
And so then I go into high school and I fell in love with history, talking about people who inspired me. My history teacher who taught me, world history and Russian history and AP US history was just this incredible guy who really engaged the classroom with a very Socratic style, really kind of very dynamic and challenged narratives about, what we thought we knew about the world, and really, just stressed the importance of history to us. And so that, I think, gelled with my interest in science and this growing awareness in the early 90s of our environmental problems. And it got me thinking, why do we have these environmental issues? Why don't people have the same relationship with the natural world that I do? And so I went to college, and I went to a small liberal arts school, Goddard College in Vermont, and it actually didn't really have a science curriculum, unfortunately. So I really got sort of driven into this history and anthropology side of things. And then the college actually closed down halfway through my education. So we found out in July that the school would not be open in the fall. There had been some financial problems. And so I was sort of cast around, not knowing what I wanted to do when I grew up, not knowing where I should land and go. And I discovered College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor. Mount Desert Island and Acadia National Park have always been really important to me. So when I found out there was a college there that also really embraced a lot of non-traditional education, sort of learning by doing and very interdisciplinary work, it seemed like a perfect fit for me. So when I went to that school, I took 3 classes because there's a trimester system. And so one class was conservation biology, one was philosophy, and one was a history and literature class. And I thought, okay, this is going to decide it, right? Which is totally the way to go about doing things. The conservation biology class really hooked me, and I realized that there was so much more to science than, what I'd learned in high school, which was very much, your sort of straight biology and chemistry, being very quantitative. And my undergraduate advisor is a natural historian. He has also a deep appreciation for history. And he always likes to say that science is gossip, hearsay, and innuendo. And he really just drove home this idea that, what we know about science is really heavily influenced by the people who are doing the science and their own sort of motivations. And also just gave me the opportunity to really make those connections between science and history that I think eventually led me to paleoecology. But the real kind of aha moment for me, I knew I was becoming increasingly interested in ecology, but there was one day where we went out in a lab and we were in Acadia National Park because the college is literally right in the back door of the park. Oh, wow. So our ecology labs were in the park. It was great. We went to these modern sea cliffs and sea caves. And if you've ever been to the Maine coast, it's classic, very rugged, rocky, no sandy beaches. And so we look at the force of the surf, and we see, how these landforms are being created by the ocean. And then we walked up a trail about 250 feet higher in elevation. And my advisor started pointing out these landforms that were really similar to the ones we had just left behind at sea level. These, rounded and rocky, craggy sea cliffs and sea caves. And he led us to the process of why would you see these same landforms, 250 feet up that you see down at sea level? And we realized that the sea level had actually lowered, and that the place we were standing had once been at sea level. At the end of the ice age, the weight of the glaciers had pushed the crust of the earth down so far because it was so heavy, and that it's actually still, even today in Maine, slowly rebounding and lifting up. And so the sea level is actually dropping a little bit in the state. And to me, this idea of change through time just hit me like a lightning bolt. It was wow, just this idea of everything we think we know about how the world works is so heavily influenced by the past. And there is no static, perfect moment in ecology, that there's dynamism and these processes that are always happening. And so even thinking about conservation and how we, preserve or conserve landscapes, and just think about those words, what they mean in terms of keeping something the way it is, are completely challenged by this dynamic past. And that suddenly was everything connected in one moment.
Well, what a brilliant way to bring everything home. I mean, taking a group of students on this almost journey through time, showing people the geology, telling people how things changed over time, letting people come to that realization. I think that is a brilliant way to get students introduced to and excited about this process. And like you're describing here, the impact of history on science and how we do science, what we're looking at, things like that. So very, very interesting. And it sounds like you've had just an incredible journey through science, Jacquelyn. And I'm particularly impressed how you were able to recover from the situation where your beloved college was closed. You're at this critical point trying to figure out what to do next in your life. And I really like your approach, the sort of door number 1, door number 2, door number 3, taking those 3 classes, seeing which one you were most excited about. So do you ever think about what would have happened if you had chosen one of those other 2 doors?
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if I would have come back to science in some other roundabout way, like maybe ended up in the philosophy of science or environmental history. I think that pull of the natural world would have been so strong that if one of the other classes had really grabbed me more than that conservation biology class, I think I would have kind of ended up in the same place, but maybe, in a humanities department instead. But maybe I would have ended back up in geography because geography is everything. So
right. Well, very, very interesting to hear about your specific journey through science and how you got to where you are today. Now, can you tell us a little bit, Jacquelyn, about one of these projects that you're working on now that you think is just the most exciting?
Yeah, so we are just now starting some new research in the Falkland Islands, actually, which has been this incredible opportunity. Most of my fieldwork has been in the Midwest of the United States, and I've never really done any international fieldwork, but I've spent a lot of time in my life on islands, and suddenly now I'm finally getting to do some research on one, but in the Southern Hemisphere, which is really, really cool. I've had this opportunity through the Climate Change Institute, which is one of my 2 departmental homes at the University of Maine. We were approached by the South Atlantic Environmental Research Institute, which is housed in the Falklands, part of the UK government. They've been trying to make these partnerships with various climate change research institutions throughout the world because climate change is one of many threats facing the Falkland Islands today. And it's also a huge hotspot of biodiversity in the South Atlantic. It's a treeless set of islands, but they're home to some of the most important seabird colonies in the world, including the largest rockhopper penguin rookery. And so we have this really unique opportunity to go down and study the past to really get a sense of how historic and ongoing land use has affected these islands and how vulnerable these species are to global change. They've been settled by Europeans since the 19th century. People brought sheep to the islands, which then started grazing, including some of the native tussock grasses that a lot of the seabirds rely on for their habitats. And also another thing that happened around that same time was the extinction of the Falkland Islands wolf, or the wara, which is the first canid to go extinct in the historic record. And so there's some, it's kind of a mystery about when the wara arrived. Did pre-European humans bring it? What's the role of fire on these islands? There's this very deeply connected link between human activity with the ecotourism and the sheep grazing as a big part of the economy. And then the sort of natural systems where you have these seabirds that, may be vulnerable to climate change. And so by studying this whole picture with all these different connected linkages between people and fire and extinction and birds, we really want to get a big picture idea of how the ecologies and the economies of the Falklands will be impacted by the next 100 years of change.
Well, Jacquelyn, you just did a wonderful job of pulling myself and our listeners in to this project, getting us excited about it by really making those connections between the research that you're doing now, but also the history of the place. I feel like I have a connection with it. I'm telling you. That's wonderful. So this sounds like a phenomenal project. So have you been to the Falklands yet, or is this something where you're planning a trip soon?
Yeah, so I was there a year ago, last November, and I just fell in love with this place. It's so amazing. It's an island with no trees, which is really fun for me because I've mostly worked on the paleoecology of North American trees. There are no large animals, no native mammals, except for this, now extinct wolf. And so it's an ecology that's so dominated by these seabirds and these grasses, and it's just a completely different kind of environment. It's just a really fascinating and beautiful place. So we're actually going back next month with 2 of my grad students. One student, Kit Hamley, will be working on the extinction of this Falkland Islands wolf, trying to piece together the archaeological record to see if humans were on the islands before Europeans and maybe figure out when this wolf arrived and if humans were involved in it showing up so we can get a better sense of the human impact to the islands through time. And then my other student, Dulcinea Groff, is going to be looking at the bird side of things. She's really interested in the subsidies that the birds are bringing from the marine environment to land, basically by pooping nutrients onto these grasses, and how essential that connection is and how vulnerable it might be to climate change. So we'll be going down there to take some peat cores to look at the last 20,000 years of environmental change to try to piece together some of these components and really get a feel for kind of like what's the natural variability in this system and how vulnerable will these species be to abrupt changes in the future.
Very interesting. Well, this sounds like an exciting project and great opportunities for you and your students to get out there, get in the field, travel a little bit, and really get exposed to this new, unique, very fascinating sounding place. So I think so far, Jacquelyn, we have painted your journey through science and the work that you're doing right now as an incredible adventure and an exciting journey. And I know a lot of days as a scientist feel like this, but I know there are some dark days as well. And I think every scientist can recall a time or two where they were struggling with something, or maybe they had a major failure that really stressed them out. So can you think back along your journey, along your career, and tell us about one of these difficult times, one of these bumps in the road that really threw you for a loop, and tell us how you got through it?
Yeah, so when I was at College of the Atlantic, I spent a summer doing an internship with the Island Research Center. COA has a couple of islands. One of them is a seabird breeding island. And this is where life starts to come full circle, because when I left college, I thought I was going to be a paleoecologist, and I had left seabirds behind. And here I am working with them again.
Right.
So we got deployed to this island. There's a generator for electricity. There's no running water. We had to bring all our fresh water on boats. We didn't shower for 10 weeks.
Oh my gosh.
So it was this really fun kind of remote field work. We stayed in an old lighthouse keeper's island. It's a lighthouse island. It's all automated now. And my project was to work with these small burrowing seabirds, the Leach's storm petrel. And my project was supposed to be part of a broader test of basically a bunch of tiny little computers with a bunch of sensors on them for things like temperature, humidity, etc. So what would happen if you deployed a whole bunch of tiny, stupid computers that together became one big smart computer? And so this was a field test. You can imagine all kinds of scenarios where this research could be really useful. So we were working with Intel to develop this moat sensor network. And these breeding seabirds in this, pretty harsh climate were a really great field test. So I was supposed to do some ground truthing and then link the data that we collected from these little computers, basically to get a sense of why these birds were choosing the places to burrow that they were choosing, because no one really knows a lot about them. They breed on these offshore islands. They fly out down to the South Atlantic in the wintertime. They only come in and out at night. They burrow underground. And so this was a really great opportunity to learn about these birds. So I started taking some measurements, burrow orientation, how big was the hole, how compact is the soil, how shaded are the burrows. And because, these eggs get left in the burrows during the day when the parents are out at sea,
Gotcha.
I can imagine that microclimate is really important. So I'm taking these measurements and then I'm done and I'm waiting. We're waiting for our shipment of these little computers to get sent. And we're waiting and a couple of weeks go by and I'm kind of helping everybody else out with their field work. And I'm still waiting and the computers haven't shown up yet.
Oh no.
It's getting down to the wire because, for my project to work, we need a certain amount of data. And finally, we get a notice that the shipment of computers has been disrupted because the Department of Defense wanted them for a different purpose.
Oh my gosh.
So basically, they couldn't send them to us because someone else wanted to try them out in a different environment somewhere. And so basically, with a couple of weeks to go in my 10-week project, I realized I was really going to have no data.
You suddenly did not have a project, right?
I did not have a project anymore. This was, supposed to turn into my senior thesis.
Oh, no.
I felt like a failure. I felt like I'd wasted everyone's time. I was being supported. People were buying me food, to stay out on this island. And I'd spent most of my time, trudging around helping other people with their projects. And I kind of felt really sorry for myself that this whole thing had failed because it was my first real research project. And looking back on it now, it just seems like not a big deal.
Right.
At the time, it was like, I can't be a scientist.
Life will not go on. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And I kind of, pulled myself together and thought, what can I do in 2 weeks? And I decided to do some GIS mapping of the island and to build a predictive model of where the birds would choose for their nests afterwards, once the field season wrapped up. And I kind of pulled it together and was able to make it work in the end. But at the time, I had just been so deeply invested in this question and this idea that I couldn't let it go, right? Mm-hmm. But now I haven't even thought about that in years, But it seemed like it was some big indictment of my ability, or like it was fate telling me not to do science. And really, in the end, it all worked out just fine.
Well, this was a phenomenal story, Jacquelyn, and I'm so glad that you told it to us today, because I think this is a really important point for younger scientists to consider. One of these moments where everything is going wrong. Literally, your project is tanked. There is nothing you can do to salvage that project at that point. And I think a lot of people have been there, or have been there to some degree. And you get to this sort of crux, this point in the road where you have to decide, am I going to continue? Am I going to try and make something work, or am I just going to give up? And I think it's so important not to give up. So great to hear about how you turned that around. You were able to salvage it, make some different project out of it that was a success. And I think this is a really important lesson for scientists. When you mentioned that point of looking back, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but at the time it was a catastrophe. So great to hear about how, even though you had one of these tough moments, you were able to turn it around, go on, have a successful career in science. And we don't just want to talk about the tough times, Jacquelyn. Can you tell us next a story of success, one of these brilliant moments in your career that you're really excited about?
Yeah. The thing that comes to mind immediately when you say that is part of how I got into grad school, which turned out to be this really exciting science connection. So I was reading the literature and trying to decide who I wanted to work with as a faculty advisor. And I learned about these Ice Age plant communities that are unlike anything we have on the landscape today. They're the same species that we have now, but they're just growing in different associations than anything we'd find now. Mostly it's like taking a handful of species from the boreal forest and a handful of species from, the temperate forest of, say, Michigan or, New York, and smooshing them together in this sort of unusual forest. And I started thinking, well, it's really interesting, that these things are showing up around the time when we have the last of these big Ice Age herbivores like mammoths and giant ground sloths and other really big animals, giant beaver, things that we don't have on the landscape today either. So maybe they're playing a role. And I stumbled upon this reference to a fungus that only reproduces in large herbivore dung. So it actually has to go through the gut of a herbivore to complete its life cycle. And I thought, well, wow, here's like this really cool opportunity to test this hypothesis. I mean, previously people had not really been able to study the role that these large animals had on vegetation, because it's really comparing apples and oranges, right? You've got a few bones in the animal record and then all of these lake records with pollen in them that tell you about the plants. And they're like completely different kinds of records. They're in different places. And so people had previously said, well, there's no way we'll ever be able to really deeply integrate the plant and animal records for most of North America. And so I thought, well, these spores should also, in theory, be in these lakes along with the pollen, and we should be able to use them as a way to show exactly when the animals go extinct around a particular lake and then how that's affecting the plants. And so I proposed to do that for my master's thesis and made a great connection with my grad advisor, Jacq Williams at Wisconsin, and he was totally on board with the research. And then, the big trick would be to see if the spores actually show up in the lakes, which they did. And we showed for my thesis research that immediately after the extinction of these Ice Age herbivores is when you saw the formation of these unusual forests. And I had originally thought that the forests would correspond with the animals, that having these sort of novel compared to today, large herbivore communities would be what's driving the appearance of these unusual forests. But what actually happened is it seems like these forests rose up as the result of the loss of these herbivores. So the herbivores are eating certain kinds of plants, they're having impacts on the landscape. And so it really does seem like North America noticed when it lost its mammoths and its horses and camels and other big animals. There was a legacy of those extinctions that lasted at least 1,000 years. And this period of kind of ecological upheaval seems to, in large part, represent a response to extinction. And that was really unusual and exciting. And my master's thesis was published in the journal Science, which was extremely exciting.
That's awesome.
Right. Which, of course, leads to where do you go from there?
Right. You've peaked early, no.
Right. Yeah, I do feel like that sometimes. And so I'm still kind of, thinking of other components of that research and ways to kind of continue to tease that forward. But I expanded on that work for my dissertation. And I continue to research the impacts of Ice Age herbivore extinctions today. But that initial success, I think, really helped just to put them on people's radar, because for a really long time, the assumption was that climate change was the most important thing determining the vegetation that we see on the landscape, at least over these really long timescales. And I think that now there's been an increased recognition that biotic interactions, or, things that animals and plants do to each other, may be just as important as the things the climate is doing to them.
Well, I think we keep bringing back this theme of connections and interconnectedness of everything that you're working on. So I love that connection between the animals, the plants, the different organisms that are impacting each other and impacting the landscape. So it sounds absolutely thrilling, the work that you've been doing, unlocking the mysteries of the earth. So when we're talking about your research, we've talked about some of these different opportunities that you've had for travel. And it just sounds like you have had some exhilarating travel experiences as well. In particular, we mentioned the Falklands. Now, can you think back, Jacquelyn, to all the places that you've been to for science? You mentioned you've done quite a bit of field research. Now, can you tell us about your favorite place that you've been to, either for field research, for a conference, things like that? And what was it about this place that really just made it so memorable?
Oh, that's a good question. Actually, I normally would have said the Falklands, but recently I've had the opportunity to go to the La Brea tar pits, which has been kind of my science mecca, or list of must-see places. As a scientist, I sort of have these really important sites for scientific research.
Sure.
And yeah, the La Brea tar pits have been on it forever. They're right in downtown LA. They've got these incredible deposits of very rich faunal record, just thousands and thousands and thousands of individuals that were trapped in these tar pits going back tens and tens of thousands of years. And so more than almost any other place, this incredible snapshot of Ice Age ecosystems that you just can't get anywhere else. And so I'd always imagined that it would be, just this bubbling lake of tar. And I got there and it wasn't like that at all. It was really interesting. You'd just be walking along outside on the sidewalk and look over onto the lawn, and just a little bubble of tar has started seeping out of the ground. And so it's really easy to imagine, how as that starts to spread, it gets covered up with leaves, maybe a wandering mastodon might get stuck in it, and then a bunch of dire wolves come and try to eat it, and then they get stuck too. And so the site itself is really cool. But what really blew my mind was getting behind the scenes into the museum collections. It was the first time I'd ever been into a museum, to the parts of the museum where the public doesn't go, into the collections. Mm-hmm. I'm an avid museum junkie. I love natural history museums. And, I've always been amazed by the stuff that you see, when you buy a ticket and wander through the exhibits. Right. But that's only a tiny fraction of what's actually there in the museum. And with the Page Museum at the tar pits, when you go back into the lab and back into collections, there are these endless rows of shelves and drawers full of saber-tooth skulls and giant ground sloth leg bones and bison ankle bones, and just drawer after drawer after drawer. And they have a whole section for saber-toothed cat bones. It's their pathological collection. So they have all these saber-toothed cats that show some sort of, pathology or disease or something. So they have so many bones, they can even have a sub-selection that's just for, bones of sick animals.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it's just like this endless expanse of, I think they have something like 6,000 dire wolves and 4,000 saber-toothed cats. It was amazing to go to the La Brea tar pits, and a colleague of mine and I are cooking up some really cool ideas to look at some of the collections that haven't been analyzed yet, namely the small mammals and the plants. So we're really excited to be working in this new site. And if you ever have the opportunity to go behind the scenes of a museum, I highly recommend it, because the scale of it is just incredible.
Well, a very cool travel opportunity that you're describing here. Definitely being able to see the tar pits. And I love this description you're giving of the behind the scenes look at a museum. I know I myself was able to go with a postdoc back in the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, and I could have stayed there for days. I was just like a kid in the candy store there. So definitely an incredible experience. If anyone gets the opportunity to see what's behind the scenes, I think you're absolutely right. It is just a tiny fraction of what's on display there, just because they have so many samples, so much stuff in the collections. There's no way they could even try to put it all out there. So phenomenal travel experience. And I think in addition to these great travel opportunities that scientists get to go to cool places, to see the world, to share their research, there are some great opportunities to work with brilliant, smart, funny, just incredible people along the way. And I think when researchers look back over their careers and think about these different groups that they've worked with, maybe in graduate school, their own lab today, things like that, there's a personality that goes along with each group. And I think you get some quirky traditions that spring up and even just some funny memories that you've shared with your colleagues. So can you tell us about one of these traditions or one of these memories today, Jacquelyn?
Yeah, so the research that we do in the field often involves, so I mentioned we core lakes, right? So how do you core a lake? Well, you have to anchor a floating platform in the middle of the lake. So it's a little bit bigger than a picnic table. It's got a hole in it. And you essentially drop a big tube down through the center and pull up meter-long segments of mud. So we were working on a very small floating platform set on a couple of canoes. There's usually anywhere from 2 to 4 or maybe 5 of us on this tiny floating platform. We have lots of specialized equipment, little screws that are machine shopped and tools and things as we have to swap out gear. And so you can imagine that one of the hazards of working on a floating platform on the water is that things can go overboard. And sometimes the things are really important and you actually have to try to get them back or you can't keep going. And sometimes they're not so important. For example, we often work with PVC tubes to put the cores in. We split them lengthwise and they're just nice hard tubes that keep that soft mud from getting squished around. And that stuff doesn't float, by the way. PVC sinks really fast.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And Sharpies do float, though.
That's good. That's good. You always get your Sharpies back.
Yeah, exactly. We always get the Sharpies back, but not the PVC. So I'd been out coring a few lakes, and something would always go overboard, whether it was a piece of PVC or a wrench. Or, I've been very fortunate, I'm going to knock on wood right now, which is to say that nothing super important has ever gone overboard, like nothing that's irreplaceable. Because some of this equipment, a lot of people don't know, for a lot of science, you can't just go to the hardware store and buy what you need. You actually have to go to a specialized shop to have it custom made. And then sometimes the stuff we use is like super weird. Like water noodles are really useful in my work because they're easily cut with like a steak knife and you can use them to sort of pack in weird places when we're transporting cores. And I've gotten some raised eyebrows from the purchasing department because they're like, why are you buying these water noodles?
All these pool parties you're having. Yeah.
Right. Or like we often work with, those really big super soaker squirt guns because it's for cleaning off the surface of the deck and getting all the mud off of it because they've got a nice force stream. So I'd been out a few times with my team of grads and undergrads. This is when I was in grad school for my research. So I was like leading the field team. And my advisor, once he knew that I could be trusted in the field, he didn't necessarily need to go on these field expeditions. And every time something would fall overboard, and, usually it was something small, and we'd go buy a replacement or get a backup. So we had a new grad student join our lab. And my advisor decided he wanted to go out in the field too, to support the new grad student while he learned how to core. And so we were out there and we would always describe these losses as a sacrifice to the lake gods, right? Like lake gods are angry, they demand sacrifice.
You have to give them an offering, yes.
Yeah, give them an offering to pacify them. So we're sitting there and I forgot my advisor was there. And I was like, all right, did anybody bring the wrench to sacrifice to the lake gods? And he kind of like looks up, like, what is she talking about? And one of my undergrads just totally rolls with it. She's like, yeah, here. She like hands over this little wrench. And she's like, I brought this one because we have 2. So we can just throw this overboard and then, lose anything else. And my advisor is like, he just blows up. He's like, you've been throwing stuff off the side of the platform? Like, How long have you been doing this? How much stuff have you thrown away? I was like, it's okay, Jacq. Like, we're totally joking.
Yeah.
Never actually done this on purpose. And then I think later on, like, we did actually lose something kind of important. I was like, see, you should have let me do it. You should have let me throw the wrench over the side.
Right.
Yeah, it's just like the little culture you get when you're working with the same group of people and you get your little in-jokes and everything. So
absolutely. And I think when you're out in the field, so many of these stories, these quirky traditions, these little funny anecdotes, things that have happened are during field research. I think you have to be creative, you have to be innovative, and you have to kind of roll with it when you're working out in the field because things are not going to go as planned, I think, most of the time. So
yeah,
absolutely great story. And I love hearing all these different traditions, all these funny stories from different labs, because I think each type of research has its own problems, has its own quirky things about it. So great to hear about what it's like being out there on a lake, all cramped onto this platform to collect cores. I love it. Now, and I think in addition to working with these groups over the years and talking to each other, about the research that you're doing. It's great to ponder these big questions in science. And I think every researcher out there has these dream questions, this list of things that they would love to be able to answer. But there's often something standing in the way. It might be things like funding, staff, technology, feasibility, even the lake gods, whatever you want to call it. And there's always something in the way. So if we took these problems out of the way, Jacquelyn, if we gave you everything, is there one question that you are just dying to know the answer to?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's less one question specifically and more a set of questions, which is the order of events, right? I want to go back to that idea of the time machine, because since I don't ever get to actually observe my study system, I can't do experimental manipulations, although I'm starting to kind of come up with creative ways around that working in the modern world. I would love a time machine to go back and really nail down things like, when did people arrive in various places? Because that actually turns out to be a non-trivial issue when trying to work out cause and effect and the role of humans. There are very few things that are as hotly debated in my field as, when people arrived in certain places and how much of an impact did they have, for example, on hunting of these large animals, and what role did humans play in their extinction globally? Or things like, I've got a student who's working on megafaunal dispersal syndrome, whether trees with really large fleshy fruits co-evolved to be dispersed by these big animals. So if you look at things like honey locust or Osage orange, nothing disperses them today, nothing eats them. Why did these trees put so much energy into making them? And so, it's really difficult to test whether mammoths would have dispersed them. So I really want to know, can I see a mammoth eat an Osage orange? Would the seed still be viable after it went through, digestive system? So there's a lot of stuff that we're really limited to correlation in paleoecology unless we can find a workaround, with substituting elephants or something. And so the time machine would help so much just to get some more direct and mechanistic evidence of some of these important processes instead of relying on this trace evidence.
Definitely. Well, just a small request there, right? No big deal. Just get a time machine, check out a few things while you're there.
Yeah, the questions are perfectly reasonable. It's just we need this ridiculous thing.
Right.
They're the same questions all the modern ecologists get to ask, but I just need a little help.
Absolutely. Well, Jacquelyn, I love these questions. I love thinking big. And exactly, I think this time machine is perfect for someone in your field to be able to go there, to see things happen, to be able to do these experimental manipulations and really be able to piece together the timeline of natural history. Great question. And I think in addition to some of these big questions that scientists like to talk about with each other, with their colleagues, their peers, things like that, it's wonderful to talk to each other about advice. Science isn't easy. So I think we can all use as much advice as we can get. So can you share with us today, Jacquelyn, what you would consider the best piece of advice that you've ever received?
Yeah, I would say it would be take advantage of every opportunity when you are in college or grad school. And there's, very much this cult of busyness that's developing where people are very, very fixated on their own projects and their own work. I know a lot of times it's hard to get people to go to department seminar, for example, because, why should I care about some neuroscientist if I'm working on
I need that hour for something
trees?
else. Right?
Yeah, I need that hour for something else. Or, I can't go to the social because, I've got to work on this other thing. But the connections that you make from those, again, only connect, here we come again. Right. The connections that you'll make with your colleagues from other fields, may sometimes even come out of left field. And I've seen really elegant applications of epidemiological modeling methods to ecology. And that somebody had a random beer after a conference once or something, because we're not reading in those fields, right?
Right.
So you never know where the connections will come from. All of my best ideas have come from reading the literature and getting outside and talking to people, oftentimes, after the convention or after the seminar. And you have to make time for serendipity in science, or you'll just become locked into your own bubble, and you can be as productive in that bubble as you want, but you're not going to do the kinds of meaningful or impactful science that I think are possible if you get outside of the bubble.
Well, I love this theme. We've developed this emphasis on connections, and I think you're absolutely right. It's so important for science. I think you're right. Taking those opportunities, going to different seminars, going to different talks will really broaden your perspective on things, open your mind, and get you in contact with some of these people who might have that next big idea that really impacts your research, or someone who just has a little bit of a spin on how they're thinking about it that can really affect something that you're working on. So great advice for our listeners out there. Now, Jacquelyn, is there any other last piece of advice or maybe a last piece of inspiration that you want to leave our listeners with today?
Yeah, I would say get on Twitter. It's been the most fruitful professional development activity I've ever engaged in. I've had funding opportunities and speaking engagements and research collaborations all come out of it. I've made connections with other scientists, with the press, with other women in science, other young faculty. And when I was in grad school, I got help with my R statistics and my methods. And it's just been an incredibly powerful tool and well worth the amount of time that I've put into it.
Fantastic recommendations. I know you're on Twitter. I'm on Twitter as well. Hopefully our listeners are on there and can follow us both. Now, Jacquelyn, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a piece of your story. Can you tell our listeners now how they can reach out and get in touch with you? Maybe mention your name on Twitter. Yes,
you can follow me on Twitter as @Jacquelyn Gill, JACQUELYNGILL. I also blog at The Contemplative Mammoth, and you can email me at jacqueline.gill@maine.edu. That's jacqueline.gill@maine.edu.
Excellent. Well, Jacquelyn, thank you again for sharing these amazing stories, having these great discussions with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun.
Absolutely. It has been a pleasure to chat with you. And thank you to our listeners out there. Join us again next time for another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to seeing you next time on People Behind the Science.